You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 520 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show today is Will Porter. He's a staff writer over at RT and just pretty much the co-host of the show now. He's been on I think 3 or 4 of the last 5 or 6 shows. So, Will, welcome back. How you doing today?
Hey, Kyle. How you doing, man? I'm all right.
All right. Well, it's been a while since I, checked in. How are things in your area? Is COVID high? Has the Black Lives Matter protests to wherever they existed in your area simmer down? It seems like in a lot of parts of the country things have. And then again, you look on Twitter today, I searched up Philadelphia, Chicago, and Portland's a big one we'll be talking about. And there does seem to be a lot going on. So how are things in your area?
Yeah, in terms of like the protests and the unrest and stuff, there were some actions that hit Detroit and a few other cities. I think like Kalamazoo or something, or Grand Rapids, I think had some pretty intense unrest. But mostly that stuff I think has kind of died down. There might be protests here and there, but there's no like big unrest that like we're seeing still in some other cities. For the COVID though, unfortunately, like there was a couple of weeks where earlier this summer where you were seeing the numbers really drop. There was one day where we didn't break 100 cases. We had like 74 cases one of those days. And so it seemed like it was kind of petering out. But the last couple of weeks it has, like we are seeing the similar spike in cases that other states are seeing in Michigan. So, it is going back up. We're having like 5 or 6 or 700 cases a day. The deaths, though, seem to pretty much be steady, which seems to also be a trend in some of these other states with a spike in cases, too. So I don't know. I don't claim to know like what explains like all the dynamics of, the surge in cases and hospitalizations and stuff. But yeah, there is a minor spike going on here in Michigan.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. And one of the ways I'm very happy about the conversations we've had about COVID, through the history on this show, not because I necessarily think that everything we've said about it has been right, but, we always look at it from the standpoint of this is, as they point out, a novel, a new virus, and the science is pretty complicated at this point. And even when you see something that looks like wearing a mask and, the questions around, does this give false confidence? Does it prevent asymptomatic people from spreading the virus? I mean, both of those things could both be true at the same time. And, how you balance that and, what positions the government should be taking. I think it's all very complicated. And, I know at the beginning of this virus, there was a lot of people, including the Hill Morning Rising team, saying that there's no more libertarians. Well, I think when we look back on this and look at what a lot of the government policies were, especially like Cuomo in New York with the elderly people who were sent back to retirement homes and stuff like that. I don't think it's going to be too flattering for the government response. And, I guess that's like kind of the very important thing I'm looking at now, because I am reading a lot about, the virus and masks and stuff like that and trying to keep up on it. And I guess the one thing I'll say is I honestly don't feel firmly either way on the issue, and that there's a lot of people that I do think are intelligent who are taking this very seriously, and who continue to recommend to take it seriously. And then there's other people who I've looked at who will say that this really isn't a big deal at all, and I think they make a lot of solid points as well. And then there's other people who say maybe it is serious, but the masks aren't working. The tests have like 30% like either false positive or negative rates. Like there's a lot of crazy things going on with this whole COVID situation. So I'm glad, Will, that we haven't come on here at all and just declared that we know what's happening. And it's all very complicated. So I don't know. I guess we should move on to this Portland thing, right? That's apparently something that libertarians don't talk about, police abuse, according to a Hawaii senator, which is part of the thing that really prompted me to, talk about this on today's show, just because me and Will, this show is foreign policy focused, but we've really talked about the Black Lives Matter protests, the death of George Floyd, and oftentimes, really trying, at least for our part, to cover the angle of the police abuse. And, we've talked about the property damage and stuff, and that's all condemnable. But, we want to make sure that we expose the police abuse and all that, because a lot of times it's this kind of injustice that gets carried away. And then you have the senator who, never talks about this stuff and actually has power to do something, comes out now that there's a rampant police abuse going on. Apparently libertarians never talk about it. So just to make sure everybody knows, libertarians really do care about this stuff, and it really is important. So it seems like for the past week or so, there's been this team of federal agents in Portland, Oregon, who are dressed in fatigues, but don't have the classic FBI SWAT or whatever labeled across their back. Typically these are supposed to be police officers and federal police, so they're not even supposed to be in fatigues. They're supposed to be easily identifiable. That way people know who they are, who's the law enforcement and everything. But that's not the case you have going on here. So if that isn't disturbing enough in some of the tactics that they're using, the military style tactics, that's all disturbing. But I think the thing that really caught people's attention is that they're throwing people in unmarked vans. And, they maybe do we have any idea where these vans are coming from? I thought maybe the issue was they didn't have enough police vehicles, either because they had gotten destroyed in recent protests or because the police are so busy. And so maybe they're using rental cars or something like that. But the look of it is very USSR Gestapo-y. So I don't know, what's just been your take? Let's start here with just the act itself of police throwing people in unmarked vans and driving them off.
Yeah, I've seen there's a lot of clips and footage and stuff coming out of Portland where people are just getting snatched up right off the street by these unmarked vehicles, and sometimes the police, the agents or officers themselves are unmarked and unidentified. And in terms of where they're getting the vans, I'm not sure where they're coming from, whether they're assets of the actual agencies, of these federal agencies. I think it's mostly Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Marshals who are involved here. And under the DHS, of course, in Portland, the border protection agents are also out there, apparently. But I have read some stuff, so I'm not sure where the vans are actually coming from. But I've definitely read that this is a deliberate tactic. This isn't a result of any kind of shortage. They're using unmarked vehicles because it helps them to remain unidentified, I guess. There was some reporting, I think, in The Nation that went over that was citing some former federal agents who were talking about how they do this all the time and rarely face any kind of legal challenge for it. But yeah, it is very alarming to see these body snatchers kind of going around scooping people up, apparently taking them to some undisclosed locations for interrogations and stuff like that. So that is pretty alarming.
Right. So, this is an obvious example of police abuse and something that, I think in some of these cases, at least you could, I think, should file kidnapping charges against these federal officers for doing that. But to talk about the federal government legal rationale behind it, I guess Donald Trump deployed these agents in response to his executive order on defending statues, something that we've talked about in the past on the show. And so that, that's really disturbing that this is happening to defend statues. I would maybe feel a little bit differently if Donald Trump were deploying these, police across the country because police in these cities were failing to protect, private businesses. And as much as I do oppose, militarized police, even doing something like that, there are a lot of people who are having their entire livelihoods destroyed. And, we live in a society with this implicit guarantee that the state's going to protect you against random violence like this. And the fact that the cops aren't even trying, I understand at least the logical line of thinking where you could get to, okay, well, Donald Trump will deploy federal, but they're deploying this is over just statues and random protesting. It doesn't seem to be targeting looters and stuff like that, which I find to be highly disappointing. We're not really protecting the property rights of any individual, rather just the monuments of the state. In most cases, although I do understand that, some of the statues mean things more than that to some people. But I guess looking at this, the ACLU have filed a lawsuit So that's going on. This, I guess, city and state are taking a pretty opposition, to this, and so I think we get into like some 10th Amendment and federalism issues, and we've even had the senator now, Ron Wyden, saying that this is an occupation force, which seems correct to me, as you alluded to before. By the way, I'll just add the Customs and Border Patrol. Their equivalent of a SWAT team is the BORTAC team, is deployed here. And I have seen them use these tactics before. And these are often like a bunch of plainclothes guys that'll jump out of a car and snatch up some Mexican guy and throw him in a van and drive off with them. I'm serious. That's just what, this team has done. And so I guess, thinking that they are using those tactics here. But what do you think of the federalism issue here? And do you think the state should just be able to kick out the federal troops in this case?
Well, yeah, I certainly do. I mean, a lot of the time with the mobilization of like National Guard units and stuff, the state government is the one in charge of doing that. So yeah, I mean, in general, I am, always in favor of decentralism and more local control and autonomy than having a, giant federal authority dispatch these sort of like stormtroopers into your state. It is an odd situation where you might have local officials who are like not as, who aren't as comfortable with this. Like a lot of the time you would see the state and feds sort of working together with this kind of thing. But yes, certainly, especially if the states are opposed to it, I would absolutely think they should have the say so here. But yeah, the CBP, it's crazy to see their SWAT teams going around just snatching people up like this. Like, I don't know how this is even arguably a border control issue, Like, yeah, Oregon, there is a border there along the ocean, but I don't see how, like, even, like, I don't know if there's any kind of rule about, like, how you can use these kind of border patrol forces when they're clearly not, protecting a border. I don't know. I know that they have been authorized under that executive order. The DHS had this whole task force to protect monuments and stuff. But I would also wonder if there's any kind of legal issue there with the CBP, like, being deployed to do stuff that has nothing to do, presumably, with border protection.
I really think so much of this, though, boils down to kind of the Russiagate narrative and the fact that the Democrats, by and large, have spent, their entire energy and movement over the past literal 4 years now, claiming that Donald Trump was a Russian agent, in a completely fake narrative. And it's thrown the entire political discourse into such a strange upheaval that things are just able to like spiral in the craziest way, and the president is essentially able to do anything that he wants. And Obama got away with drone striking American citizens, and nobody wanted to challenge that on the left, and the genocide in Yemen's going on with absolutely zero coverage every single day. And so I think that's a big part of it, in that, like, I don't like the idea that we're in a post-truth world or anything like that, but I do think we're in a scenario where so many people are just kind of comfortable existing in their own bubbles with their own truth that, people get away with stuff like this. There's two more things I wanted to mention, and one is potentially some of these federal officers not getting away. The Oregon Attorney General, I guess, is looking into filing charges. My guess is that, the sheriffs aren't going to start arresting these federal officers. But maybe this is a tactic Oregon uses to get these federal forces out of there. And then I just read antiwar.com, Jason Ditz writing that facing mounting lawsuits and complaints from Oregon officials for the federal crackdown on Portland, Oregon, Department of Homeland Security Acting Secretary Chad Wolf issued a memo in which he suggests that this sort of action is going to become the norm. And so I think that's disturbing enough as is. But Will, what else do you have to say about this? And I mean, how important is it that as much as the protesters and the looting and the destruction of village, a lot of these towns and stuff. I mean, I was looking at some of the Michael Tracy coverage as he's driving across the country and covering the aftermath of these protests. There's a lot of people who lost their livelihoods because of this protest, and it's absolutely unacceptable. But this is all about the statues. It's all about protecting, the state monuments, the state structures, and not about private business.
Yeah, so in addition to these unmarked officers going around in unmarked vans, basically, body snatching people up off the street, there are a lot of issues there. But we've also seen with these federal police just like some more basic standard police abuse issues. Last weekend, you had a protester who was shot in the face or in the head with one of these less lethal rounds. They often like to call them non-lethal, but they can be lethal. So I prefer to go with less lethal. But they had shot this guy in the head with one of these rounds, and it shattered his skull. He needed facial construction surgery. And so, they're doing this kind of thing too, just abusing people in addition to, throwing them in the back of these vans. And apparently the local police in the city in Portland have been sort of restricted in their use of these riot control munitions, but not the feds. And so I think that's something that's kind of important there too, is they apparently are working under fewer restrictions than some of the local cops. But then also, if you look at like the ACLU lawsuit, you see also that these feds appear to be targeting journalists and stuff too. So I think that's also a major, we've seen this in other, in Minneapolis, you had a lot of incidents like this too, where the cops seem to be targeting journalists, but the feds now appear to be doing that in Portland. So I think that's another, thing to consider.
Right. And, the important thing here is, I guess, what happens if somebody, hops in one of these vans and isn't heard from? And how is anybody going to be able to like track down what happened to this person?
Right.
If the cops decide to kill and dump somebody who, there's so much that could go on. And police are supposed to follow certain protocols because at the end of the day, they're supposed to be accountable and there to protect the people and their property. And, it's no more clear today than ever than what libertarians have been saying. I've only been libertarian for like 8 or 9 years now, but pretty much one of the first things I picked up on is that the war on drugs and the militarization of police is absolutely abusive, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. The more military equipment you give police, the more they use it against us. The more they use it against us, the larger the protests get against them. The more violence the protesters use, and it's, at this point, it's just spinning out of control. To the point where these are, I'm sure, scenes that wouldn't look all that out of place in the USSR. Now, I guess I do understand that for at least all we know, that all these people are just being processed and released and, not, sent to the gulag in Siberia. But that said, there are people in the U.S. who do get 5-year sentences and then, are faced with either you go and work at a call center for a couple bucks an hour. It's not quite slave labor, but, with the fact that they charge you like $5 a minute to make phone calls and mark up everything in the commissary 400%, that, your $2 doesn't go very far anyway. And the other option is you get sent to solitary confinement or something like that. The conditions in the U.S. today are pretty bad. They look better and cleaner on the outside, but in the real bowels of the system, we're seeing how ugly and awful it is here. And these are things that we've been trying to expose and talk to people about and roll back. The first real, I guess, legislation offered by a libertarian in Congress was Justin Amash's and the Qualified Immunity Act. I mean, if we want to hold people accountable, we get rid of qualified immunity. Every single one of these federal, police officers could go to jail for kidnapping. And that, I guarantee they stop doing it real quick. Well, if they end up working in those call centers and having a terrible life in prison. So,
No kidding.
I think that's the route that you have to go, is find some way to hold the cops accountable. But it doesn't look like anybody with actual power is interested at all in doing that. So let's hop overseas now and talk about South Korea, where throughout the Trump administration, the Korea policy has been all over the place. Looking at the debate around Trump coming into office, a lot of people said one problem would be is he would be too erratic. And I think that might be a fair qualification of what's gone on with his Korea policy, where he went from fire and fury to let's make a deal to hiring John Bolton, then going to the DMZ, but, not actually offering anything to like make a deal with North Korea. And now suddenly maybe is interested in making a deal again and removing some troops from South Korea. So Will kind of give us the scoop on what's going on there.
Yeah, so the U.S. has been putting quite a bit of pressure on the South Koreans, pretty much throughout the Trump administration, to start coughing up more money to sort of finance and foot the bill for the nearly 30,000 American troops that are stationed there in the South. I think last year the South ended up paying like $900 million for that deployment. That was like a 10% increase from the year prior. But at one point recently, the Trump administration was talking about asking for $5 billion for 2020, and so that'd be like 5 times more than what they currently pay. And by all indications, the South Koreans are not going to go with that. They're not willing to pay that much for a single year. However, there were reports that they were making a counteroffer to pay more than $5 billion, but spread out over 5 years, where they sort of slowly ratchet up their spending. However, Trump has rejected that, and there's still currently no new deal for how to do this. The special measures agreement, they call it, the thing that sets out like who spends what on the U.S. forces in Korea, that expired last December and has not been renewed. And so right now things are kind of in limbo. However, so with all this disagreement over spending in South Korea over the U.S. deployment there, the administration has actually been considering a troop drawdown, as you said, in South Korea, which is something that Trump has threatened to do before. But most recently, the latest development here, we have a report in the Wall Street Journal saying that a troop review has actually now made its way to the White House. And the Pentagon had been asked to come up with options for that last fall, and now it's actually finally at the White House. Now, like I said, there has been some talk of this previously, and so the fact that this is just popping up now again in a major newspaper like the Journal, that could just mean that the administration wants to remind the Koreans of this threat that, like, hey, we will withdraw troops. However, I think it also could be a sign that things are moving ahead here and that they are actually going to be seriously considering these options that have been developed by the Pentagon. Trump has, he does seem to have some desire to end some of these deployments overseas. We've seen him try in Syria and Afghanistan, and to some extent Germany most recently. But he just constantly hires terrible advisors and surrounds himself with all these hawks, and he's very easily swayed by the people he surrounds himself with. And so we haven't really seen these things go forward as much or as quickly as we'd like. Afghanistan is probably the biggest one. But yeah, it does now seem like they could be considering a significant troop drawdown in South Korea. I mean, I should say the U.S. does not need 30,000 soldiers in South Korea. It's outrageous. They'd pretty much be cannon fodder in the event of any real war with the North. Which I don't think is really on the horizon anyway. I don't think that's really around the corner. And this U.S. deployment doesn't really deter an invasion anyway, which is apparently it's what it's for. I really think the idea is more to send a message to China to have these tens of thousands of soldiers there fairly close to Chinese borders. I think it has more to do with that than deterring any kind of North Korean invasion of the South. And the South, too, we should note, is they're a rich capitalist country. They have an advanced military. They spend like 5 times more on their military than the North, I think. And so they don't really need these soldiers there protecting them. Really, our presence in the South there, it's a extremely provocative thing for the North. And it's been this huge ongoing obstacle between the two sides and sort of their relations, having this huge contingent of American soldiers there, basically like what the North would see as like an invasion force. And so in many ways, this deployment is worse than just unnecessary and pointless. It's actually like outwardly counterproductive. And so I think that's kind of where things stand here. Like there is a troop review. It seems to be moving ahead. But they have not made any kind of like decision on a drawdown, and we don't really have much detail about what that might entail, about when that might happen, or like how many soldiers they might pull out. Ultimately, this could just be a way of threatening the South that we're gonna just to pressure them, leaking out these reports into major newspapers. However, I think it also very well could suggest that this could move ahead.
Right. So you kind of have the difference here between kind of the fake America first that Trump advocates for. That's like South Korea and Germany need to pay more for our defense versus real American first, which is bring the troops home. But the next question I want to ask is just, do we have any idea if this is at all a part of talks with North Korea or South Korea as far as negotiations go? I know recently Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea, has been really making a push to get talks between Trump and Kim before the November elections. I know North Korea has publicly rebuffed these pretty solidly, and I would definitely understand if North Korea's position is we're done talking with the Trump administration after the debacle with John Bolton at Hanoi. But maybe if Donald Trump is looking at withdrawing troops, it seems like the art of the deal would at least get something for his money, even if it's just North Korea agreeing not to test any missiles for the next 3 months, or reopening communication lines with South Korea or something like that.
Yeah, if anything like that is going on, like behind the scenes, in terms of like this is part of some kind of broader deal, the reporting definitely didn't reflect that. It definitely seems like this is more of just a thing the Trump administration is doing to put pressure on the South. Now, I guess it could be possible that this is some like they're trying to, they're going to use this. I don't know, they're going to use the disagreement over South Korea's spending over troops to pull out some American troops, and then that's going to somehow factor into some kind of deal with the North. I guess that's possible, but it didn't really seem like that was what's going on here. It seemed more like the Trump administration is trying to sort of like threaten and posture against the South to pay out more money.
Yeah, I generally agree with you. I will say, though, recently the U.S. seems to pretty quietly have negotiated a little bit of a prisoner swap with the Iranians. So, maybe it could be happening in the background and we not know about it. Especially, if Trump is considering withdrawing a lot of troops, I could definitely see, him saying that we're going to get some from the North Koreans for this. I want to move on to Afghanistan, where we have another. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add one last thing about the South Korea thing. Something that you should watch out for, I guess, because right now, unfortunately, both in the House and the Senate, they're trying to pass legislation that would block the Pentagon from reducing the troop number in South Korea below a certain level. I think below 28,500, which is basically where it's at now. And so they're trying to block that unless the defense secretary will certify that North Korea has become less of a threat and that this drawdown wouldn't hurt U.S. national security. So I think even if the White House is serious about this drawdown, Trump is now going to be facing some opposition from hawks, in both parties here, in terms of in both houses too. So this pretty much is just like every other attempt he's made to withdraw troops. He faces all this opposition from hawks.
Well, dang. Well, that was how I was going to transition to talking about Afghanistan. Because in Afghanistan, the Congress is also trying to prevent Donald Trump from bringing troops home. But you're saying that there is a new potential ambassador that could help bring in the troops home. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So this is kind of another story where it's like this could happen, like, sort of like the drawdown in South Korea. It's not totally we're not totally clear on what will happen here, but the administration right now is apparently weighing whether to tap this guy, Will Ruger, to be the ambassador of Afghanistan, where he'd go and replace Ross Wilson, who's like only in an acting position. I think he's just the embassy head out there. But from what I've seen, this Ruger guy is actually pretty good. He's in some kind of high up research position at the Charles Koch Institute, and he's a foreign policy researcher at Cato. And so he is some kind of like Beltway. He's in the Beltway libertarian world, you'd say. And this is the guy who they're considering for ambassador. And I was reading through some of his stuff and like looking at his Twitter, and he strikes me as kind of like a realist type. He's not an outright non-interventionist like we are, but he's somebody who generally does want to see a significant reduction of the U.S. military footprint around the world. And he often will talk about like, using restraint, kind of like, Andrew Bacevich or Dan McCarthy or a Stephen Walt type, sort of these realist types. He does seem to agree also with people in our camp that the U.S. political establishment hates Trump first and foremost because of what he might do in foreign policy. And he apparently sees himself as separate from like that whole like media think tank political world in D.C., like the blob, you might call it. And so if you see him on Twitter, he is often like staking out positions in opposition to the blob. So I think that's a great sign. On Afghanistan specifically, he has called for a full withdrawal there. He's saying that should happen even without a peace deal between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And he's saying the current drawdown happening should be accelerated. They should be doing that much more quickly. He's also specifically argued against leaving some kind of residual force in Afghanistan. He's saying that like there should just be a complete 100% speedy pullout because it's been, we've been there for 2 decades. We need to leave now. And then on other positions, like he's last year, he also backed Trump's announced withdrawal from Syria, saying that like nothing good could come out of staying there. So I don't know. On some of these questions, he does seem fairly decent. At least he's not terrible. I'm sure he may have some flaws. I'm not really sure what he thinks about China, for example. But where it matters, at least on Afghanistan, he does look pretty solid. And this is the guy who may become the ambassador. However, I will say, unfortunately, right now, it's so far into Trump's term now that even if Ruger were selected, he probably wouldn't get Senate confirmation until it's pretty much too late. It would take a while. And so I think Trump would have to win re-election for this Ruger guy to really have a chance to do much. But I guess this is one little glimmer of hope we might have if this guy does get in there. It's not that ambassadors really have like a ton of, absolute power over policy or anything. But I would much rather have a decent realist like this guy in there than an outright hawk. And so, this would be some kind of minor victory if this guy were tapped.
Yeah, no, I mean, this seems like a good thing. He's writing at the American conservative, some good stuff that I read in the past. So I do think, if this is somebody who gets in, at least then you would have somebody within like the organized government bureaucracy that handles Afghanistan that is dedicated to bringing troops home. And, somebody who hopefully would, have like the principle that if the U.S. is doing something sketchy in Afghanistan, he finds out about it, either to expose it or resign or help to end it, at least a little bit of something. So, this is, again, this would be the real kind of America first that we want, not, the fake kind of, American first that we've mostly gotten under Trump. I will say at least as much as, there's the acting ambassador, it seems like Zalmay Khalilzad is continuing to do a pretty decent job of facilitating, agreements and peace and, I guess not peace, but reduction in tensions with the Taliban. So even if this guy doesn't get in, at least there are some negotiations between the two. Yeah. Do you have anything else on that, or can we move on here to Israel?
I guess I'll just say that like Ruger has come out and he has backed Zalmay Khalilzad's efforts in Afghanistan toward like reconciliation and a deal and stuff. So I guess that's good. Like we might have some like, inside baseball issues with the Koch Institute or, that kind of beltway, sect of libertarianism. But I would absolutely like to see Trump start calling on those kind of people to, fill positions in his administration.
All right, so I want to ask you about Israel because I think probably the most important thing not being reported right now happening in the world is the string of events in Iran that could be, at least some of them are, and potentially others could be a string of attacks or acts of sabotage, facilitating terrorism by Israel or the U.S. within Iran, including cyber attacks and potentially, physical attacks. And so you had this article here from Business Insider that you sent me, basically saying that, hey, Israel seems to be wanting to start a war with Iran sometime before November. Of course, the important date there is the U.S. election. So what do you think about that, Will?
Yeah. So last week we were talking about all those strange incidents in Iran, the explosions and the fires and the power outages and stuff, a lot of which seemed like they could have been some kind of sabotage or cyber attack, something like that. We were talking about that in the context of possible U.S. operations, because we had recently learned that the CIA has been authorized to launch these aggressive cyber attacks without White House approval. However, now we have this story, like you said in Business Insider, suggesting that Israel is actually behind all this stuff. And that's, the story is citing a former Israeli defense official and a current EU intelligence officer. And the story doesn't get into a ton of detail. It doesn't tell us how exactly they know that it's the Israelis, but it basically just relays this assertion that the Israelis are behind this and says that for a lot of Israeli officials, it's like common knowledge that it's Israeli intelligence that's involved in some of these incidents. So that's kind of like the tenor of the piece. That's what we're hearing from this Israeli defense official. Saying that it's basically universally known that Israel must be behind some of these things. There has been a lot of speculation over the last few weeks that this is the case, that it's either the Israel or the U.S. doing these things. We have had other Israeli officials come out and kind of vaguely hint at this in public, being kind of very suggestive when they're asked about it by reporters, saying Israel will do what it needs to protect itself, or that kind of vague response that implies that they are doing these things. Then you also had this unnamed intelligence official who, by the context and the wording of it, was most likely Israeli. But this intelligence official telling the New York Times that they were behind the explosion at the Natanz nuclear plant earlier this month. And so there have been, in addition to this insider story, quite a few things pointing to this being true about, Israeli involvement. The Israelis do have a fairly strong cyber capability, and they will sometimes work with the U.S. on these kind of attacks, like they most likely did in 2010 with the whole Stuxnet virus thing that shut down a bunch of centrifuges at the same Natanz facility where they enrich uranium in Iran. So it's not totally clear to me whether this is purely an Israeli thing, like this defense official is telling Business Insider, or whether the U.S. has some involvement here. But we do now have some, additional indication that the Israelis may be behind this. You also had a EU intelligence guy backing up this idea of Israeli involvement in that same story. And he was saying that the Europeans are worried that the Israelis are trying to get into a military confrontation with Iran before the U.S. election in November. And he explained he thinks that because Biden would be less supportive of such a thing. And so the Israelis, they think, are feeling some pressure now to escalate things while they have a chance with Trump in office. And so that's certainly an interesting possibility. There's nothing like really definitive in the story, but it's definitely worth considering given all these weird things happening in Iran that like, I think, some of them may be unrelated. Some of them may have, just be run of the mill accidents or fires or whatever. But the sheer number of them does kind of suggest that something more is going on. And I think the idea of Israeli involvement is probably just as likely as U.S. involvement. But this Business Insider story does give a little more weight to that idea of, these are foreign actors behind these incidents.
Yeah, I think it also adds a little bit of weight to the kind of thing I was thinking too, which is even if some of these events, we know that a couple of them were, I think they've been outright claimed to be cyber attacked, the one at the Natanz and one at the port. But overall, if the others are not, they certainly seem to be invested in giving off the impression that they are behind it, which, suggests that they're trying to elicit the same response that they would have if they were or not. You know what I mean? So I don't know. It seems pretty clear to me that, as what you're saying, that this is an effort to provoke Iran, that, they're trying to get this country to respond as if they're being sabotaged, attacked repeatedly by Israel.
Right. I think the idea here, too, would be to like launch a covert attack against Iran and then get them to overtly respond, because that's how the Israelis want to do it. They want to make it look like the Iranians basically, fired the first shot here.
I see that point, but at the same time, in Trump administration, I'm not sure it would matter. But before we wrap up here, Will, I want to give a couple minutes just to talk about Yemen, because it is the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and it is getting so much worse. And at the same time, all I really have to say about it is bad news. So it's hard to come on and talk about every single show, but there's been a couple atrocities by Saudi Arabia recently in northern Yemen. Killing at least a score of people. I think they're thinking about 23 after they hit a house, and then the week before they killed 7 by hitting a house. So the air war is still on. At least on Twitter, I saw some retweets and stuff posted by Nasser Arabi explaining that they found U.S. bomb fragments. Looks like I think Raytheon made bombs at the house of one of these massacres, and so. For the people of Yemen, it makes an awful lot of sense if they think that, it was the U.S. that dropped the bomb, since it was a U.S. bomb that came out of a U.S. plane in a war that could only be waged with U.S. assistance and U.S. diplomatic cover. So, that's the situation in northern Yemen. It seems like the situation in southern Yemen is getting quite a bit more complicated as well, with, I guess, the UAE bat side on the island of Skahoda is now in control of the island, and the Hadi government that's backed by Saudi Arabia doesn't have control there. There's been reports of ceasefires and then breakdowns of ceasefires between the Saudi-backed and the UAE-backed sides in the capital city of Aden and in other cities of southern Yemen not controlled by the Houthis. This includes the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council. These seem to be a group of commies looking to create their own commie state in southern Yemen, versus the Saudis who backed the Hadi government. I think there's like some, like an army division or two that was former loyalists to Salah, the president there, for a long time, and then some other mercenary forces, Sudanese mercenary forces, and they're squaring off in various cities, including, I believe, what was at the start of the war the third largest city in Yemen, Taz, has, now been on the front lines of this battle for quite a long time. And I think a lot of people have either fled to Hadada or Aden from that city. But that's a mess. There's also tens of thousands of Ethiopians who, for a long time on the show, I was trying to figure out why Ethiopians were crossing into Yemen. Apparently, that's the way that they get to Saudi Arabia every year to do like migrant work, to send remittance back to Ethiopia. So tens of thousands of these people have been captured by both sides in this conflict. And I guess the transferring of these people around is spreading the COVID. And then the last thing I'll mention is that the humanitarian situation in Yemen is abysmal. I'll link to an audio by Giorgio Caffiario in the show notes page. And, for those of you who want to take the time and read all of his little details about how it's getting worse, but, me and Will have detailed the humanitarian situation in Yemen, the kids starving, the cholera, COVID is just one more thing on top of it. And as you could imagine, with at least 100,000 dead from the conflict, unknown thousands dead from starvation and other treatable diseases, at least, 2,000 dead from cholera already, and just no ability to control or test for COVID in any way. Even if you're somebody who's not like on the side that COVID's a big deal here in the US, well, this is Yemen, a country with almost no hospitals anymore. So many of them have been bombed and destroyed. It's hard to get clean water. There's not a lot of capital. There's no ventilators. There's no just facilities and PPE. Like, that's something they haven't had in the middle of a war zone for 5 years, and so it's only getting worse. And Will, I'll let you wrap up with whatever you want to add on Yemen.
Yeah, sure. I mean, like you're pointing out, COVID might not, even if you're sort of a skeptic of COVID, if you see how Yemen had such a hard time treating cholera, which, like, yeah, cholera does sound like a nasty infection. It is a nasty bacterial infection, but it is fairly easily treatable with like saline. It shouldn't be that hard to treat. But Yemen had an extremely hard time doing that because of how poor and war torn the country is. And when you're talking about these civilian incidents, like, this recent thing where I think there was 23 or 25 people killed in a Saudi airstrike. With that, I think that case kind of illustrates one of the major ongoing problems in the conflict, because there were all kinds of conflicting numbers for that strike. I had seen that some were Xinhua and Middle East Eye were saying 25, Reuters had it at 7, AFP had it at like 12. And I think Houthi officials even gave some conflicting numbers. One said 9, another said 12. But this kind of like just illustrates the difficulty in counting casualties in this conflict. I mean, like I think the number I've seen thrown around a lot lately. I haven't done a lot of work on this trying to follow and track the casualties as I did previously. But like, you see this number 100,000 thrown around a lot, and it has to be so much more than that. It has to be probably not an order of magnitude, but multiple times that figure we keep hearing. And a major problem here is all the health facilities and they rely on health facilities to get this data, and like over 60% of those in Yemen have been destroyed or damaged. And so this is a major ongoing issue. It's like even just counting how many people are being killed in this conflict because they can't get the data out, and how much more that's complicated by COVID and all these other problems. Like, it's probably hard to quantify at this point.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. One time I was having a conversation with Scott Horton about the Vietnam War, and I was just saying to him, it seems unbelievable that like in history we wouldn't know if we killed between 1 and 3 Vietnamese in that war, 1-3 million. It just seems like, the range could be between 1 million and 1.5 million. And, that seems, but how could you not know if you killed 2 million people or not? It's at least twice as many that you may have killed of your bottom line estimate. And so it's absolutely shocking that you wouldn't be able to count that much. And he points out that, look, villages were just wiped off the map.
Exactly.
They existed and then they did it and nobody knew about it. And I don't think that probably happens in many places in the world today. But I do think it could probably happen in Yemen, especially if something happens, out in the tribal area. Saudi Arabia isn't going to be like, hey, everybody, we bombed a truck full of children. It's just some family trying to go to the hospital or to get some food. And we bombed them, that truck just explodes. And those are those people's lives. And not that if people knew about it, they would have gotten justice anyways, but at least maybe their deaths would be counted by ACLED and go to strengthening the case to end the war that is every day just becoming more and more the genocide that we have now been for years. Will, warning is going to be the case.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like you might not see entire villages wiped off the map so much in Yemen, but definitely entire families have been killed. I've definitely seen that, where like a whole lineage is just completely wiped out. And yeah, they're having equally hard trouble counting up those casualties there in Yemen too.
Right. I remember this one story about a family that was sleeping in like a hole on one side of a cinder block wall. And then the Saudis shot an airstrike and it hit just on the other side of that wall. But I was thinking to myself, if the airstrike had landed 10 feet the other way, would anybody have been able to count how many people were there or even have known?
Yeah.
They were just a family of refugees sleeping in a hole in the ground, like quite literally. And, even if people did know that, they were staying in that area and knew that the airstrike had hit, I mean, I'm guessing that there wouldn't be a hole left if a 500-pound bomb had landed on them.
Yeah,
So,
they'd have to do some real careful forensic reconstruction, which I'm not sure how much of that's going on after airstrikes in Yemen right now.
right. All right. Well, I guess enough of the bad news for today. And keep doing good work over at RT. Tell people where to follow your work this week.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a staff writer at RT. Probably the easiest way to find my work is on Twitter. And actually, I just changed my Twitter handle. So I think I'm the Will Porter now. It's easier to find than my previous one. So just the Will Porter at Twitter. And then I have archives at the Libertarian Institute, Consortium News, antiwar.com, and the Daily Sheeple.
All right. Well, that's a great prompt for me. I've also changed my Twitter handle. I'm no longer the at KYAAALE, my attempt to be the Cartman guy thing. So I am Kyle Ansloan, my first and last name, and then underscore at the end of it because somebody had already stolen Kyle Ansloan. So Kyle Anderson and then an underscore. And make sure if you're not following me, you do that. I'm trying to be a little bit more active on social media these days. Make sure you check out the Libertarian Institute for all my work, including the Daily News Roundup. It's all on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org. And then I think that's all I got to plug today. So thanks for coming back on the show, Will.
Thanks, Cal.
All right.